Good morning and welcome. And I first want to say that I was awarded only 35 minutes to this discussion, but since Professor Ganor is the incoming president, we'll delve into it later. Anyhow, the headline of this discussion ahead is Shifts in Global Architecture. And I must say that I love this mild understatement. There are some assumptions here. First of all, there is or was a global architecture, and it is in the process of shifting and not, let's say, totally crashing down on us. So in the next 35 minutes, we will delve, or at least try to outline, what is happening, try to challenge some conventional wisdom, and perhaps agree that, yes, conventional wisdom is right about certain things. And we should always remember, in this discussion and in everything, that the best eyesight is not 20/20, but hindsight. Obvious example. A couple of years ago, a man sits in his office in the Kremlin and decides to invade Ukraine. He doesn't call it invasion, of course, but after consulting two people, Ekaterina the Great and Ivan the Terrible, and he has four presumptions. And he says that so. First of all, the Ukrainians, at least those who are from Russian origin or speak Russians, will embrace their brothers lovingly. Second, that the Ukrainian army will put at maximum token resistance. That the Russian army is the successor of the formidable Red Army, and the West, hedonistic, divided, dependent on Russian energy, will do nothing, perhaps some UN resolution, and back to business as usual. And of course, all these four assumptions appeared very, very solid, and all of them came crashing down. Putin can still win, to be sure, not the victory that he envisioned, not the victory that he wanted, but we'll discuss it and many topics in the next 35 minutes. So first of all, I'd like a headline from each one of you. What do you think is the greatest threat to global architecture, to global order at the moment? Dr. Weinstein, start with you.
Great, wonderful. Delighted to be here. Wonderful to be back at Herzliya. Mazel tov on your appointment and on the 20th conference. Remember being here for the first, and this place has grown immensely. I'll be conventional and say the potential of a conflict over the Taiwan Straits.
Okay. Ambassador Kausikan.
I think the greatest threat is not changing rapidly enough or in a correct way to changes in the global architecture. And that in turn usually arises from dysfunctionalities in political processes, whether they are democratic processes or authoritarian processes.
When you say not changing, who doesn't change enough?
All of us.
All the actors.
We have to adapt to changes in the strategic environment, but we must first of all interpret those changes correctly, and we usually don't, to my mind.
Thank you. Professor Ganor?
You know, Oren, being an Israeli, everybody would expect that I would say that the biggest challenge and the biggest threat in the global arena today is Iran. And it's probably so. But I think that the real big problem, and even bigger than Iran, is United States. And actually, I'm referring to the fact that United States traditionally is isolationist. And it's a bipartisan. It's not Republicans and Democrats. And I'm not criticizing the Americans for that, but still, I would argue that American isolationism is changing the global architecture, and we practically are shifting in a transition time from a unipolar system into a multipolar system, and that's the biggest threat to the global arena.
Thank you. And now I want to delve into the subjects. First of all, I'd like to start with you, Dr. Weinstein. In your country, the topic of world architecture is very possible that in a year and a half, somebody will win the presidential election, meaning Donald Trump, whose words are an anathema to him, and he wants to return to isolationism, and he and some of his supporters want to destroy this global architecture that benefited the United States so much. How big a threat is that?
Well, I think there's certainly a chance Donald Trump could be elected president. I wouldn't bet on it. I think we're still early in the primary process. There'll be a lot of money spent, a lot of candidates out there criticizing him. Republicans still remember the numerous 3 electoral defeats so far under him in a row, so I wouldn't bet all that heavily. I think the greater challenge is the dynamic that Professor Ganor pointed to, which is American isolationism, but also the opposite, which is a tendency that you need to rally the American public against this isolationist tendency that causes an even stronger counter-reaction. And so you've got both things going on in our country right now.
You could argue that, as Professor Ganor said, and as you agree, that Uncle Sam doesn't want to be the world policeman anymore. But there's no vacuum. If Uncle Sam will not be the policeman of the world, Uncle Vladimir will be, or more probably, Uncle Xi will be. The Americans don't understand it?
No, they do. And I think if you look particularly at the Republican leadership and the people chosen to head the various committees in the House and the Senate, particularly in the House side, which really matters since they have the majority, these are internationalists. These are people who are trusted by our allies, who have been believe in the international order, have spoken up openly. This year, Mitch McConnell went to Munich to make the case that it's been Republicans who actually pushed President Biden to arm the Ukrainians when President Biden didn't want to. So the question is, there's isolationism on both the left wing of the Democratic Party, but there's a bigger isolationist wing on the right wing of the Republican Party, and both need to be kept in check.
Oren, you said we can interrupt, right? You want it as a discussion.
At least the president
And
can.
I'm in Israel, you know, so
Yeah.
I'm interrupting. I would like actually to follow up these words and your question about the fact that there is no vacuum. And I want to go back to my special expertise, which is counterterrorism. And I refer to the war against Daesh in Syria. Now, in 2014, President Obama declared no less than a war on ISIS. I'm using his words. We are at war with ISIS. But it came with this American concept, which, by the way, I agree with them, no boots on the ground. So it's a war, but no boots on the ground. So I was walking in the Pentagon corridors, and I tried to persuade some of my friends there, if not boots on the ground, at least sandals on the ground or something on the ground, because without that, you have no way to win a war against what we call a hybrid terrorist organization, a terrorist organization which controls territory and population and embedded within the civilian society. Since without boots on the ground and with a very extreme limitation to the American air bombing because of liberal democratic values, proportionality, and so on and so forth, a vacuum was created. And the vacuum didn't stay there because the axis of evil got into this vacuum, which is Iran, Russia, Syria, and Hezbollah. And they won the war, not United States.
Yeah.
They were the one who won the war against ISIS.
And you could argue, of course, that ISIS began when George Bush invaded Iraq, but that's a different matter. Ambassador Kausikan, I want to talk to you, I want to ask you about China. Every day we read about the inevitable rise of China, the inevitable ascendance, 21st century will be the Chinese century, etc., etc. I want to ask you, perhaps China is not as strong as we see it, because there are demographic tendency, because there is the dictatorship of Xi Jinping, because the economy got problems, because China is dependent upon chips that she needs to import from other country. Perhaps it's not as strong, and the West is not as weak as we sometimes are led to believe.
Well, I'll answer that, but let me say, preface that with something.
Yes.
All I've heard so far, both from my colleagues and from you, is an example of what I meant by not adapting to change or misinterpreting the nature of change. Right? There's a certain nostalgia there for a world that is no longer existent. Right? The world has changed. Deal with it. There's no point being nostalgic about something that no longer exists. The US is still very dominant in many areas and will continue to be dominant, but not as dominant as before. It's also a mistake to think that a global architecture must be a unitary architecture. Mm-hmm. For most of the 20th century, the second half, for almost 50 years, the global architecture was defined by competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. Two systems, anyway. And it was a pretty stable architecture in the sense that it was competitive, often dangerous, but it lasted almost 50 years, and there was no major war between the two principles. Many proxy wars, and we are coming back, and we are being nostalgic for a very short period of, I don't know, maybe 20 years after the Berlin Wall came down, right? Where the unchallenged dominance of American power made it seem that there was only one architecture. Now, that architecture was good for...
Fukuyama period.
No, that Fukuyama is an idiot now. I mean, but it was...
of course.
End of history. Anybody thinks that history ends is an idiot, right? But that's another matter. Look, we are now returning to a more historically normal period where the global architecture will be one of competition between China and the United States. It's important to understand
but
the competition.
It never happened in history before. It's a totally new phenomenon.
Who says it never happened in history before?
Between the United States and China?
No, it happened before in history many times, countless times, between two major powers.
Of course.
But now this is the new phenomenon. You are right, China does not have supernatural powers, and we are beginning to realize that rather belatedly. It has many problems, you have mentioned that. But that's not the really unique characteristic of this era. The unique characteristic of this era is that I know of no country, not the closest ally of the United States, nor the most dependent country on China, that isn't without concerns about some aspect or another of both American and Chinese behavior. Mm-hmm. Simultaneously, I know of no, I think all of us are beginning to realize, some more quickly than others, that we have to deal with both the US and China simultaneously in order to deal with either effectively. Put these two things together, what do you mean? What do you see? You see an order of greater fluidity as countries seek more strategic, I don't like the word autonomy, flexibility, strategic flexibility within the constraints of their own circumstances. And in order to deal with this situation, this more fluid, dynamic situation, we cannot be nostalgic. We cannot look backwards. We cannot hope for something that no longer exists and only existed for a very short historical period, maybe 20 years at the most.
So, Professor Ganor, I want to continue some of the thread of the ambassador. We have become accustomed in thinking wrongly in terms of West versus East, you know, the Cold War, etc., etc. And since Kipling and even before that, perhaps now one of the phenomena that we see is North versus South up to a point. We see more regional powers identified with the global South, even though many of them are north of the equator. We see India, we see Brazil, we see African countries, not to mention Turkey and Iran, and we see that significant part of them are not interested in this major competition, are not interested in Ukraine, are not interested in what we used to call global values, as long as it doesn't interfere with them, or only in the parts that affect them, let's say the global food crisis.
Listening to my colleague, the ambassador, I find myself agreeing with you that we cannot afford being nostalgic. And we are living in a very dangerous time of transition, and we should acknowledge that, and we should adapt to that. But I'm afraid that your observation is also leaning on the nostalgic approach, because you are saying that we are shifting practically from a unipolar global system into, again, a bipolar system, but it's not a USSR versus...
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we're going into a much more fluid system, which is got many characteristics of multipolarity, but it's not quite.
That I would definitely agree, because the difference between a bipolar system is what I see, and that's coming back to your question, that we are shifting into a multipolar system, and this is much more dangerous.
Perhaps I'd say not multipolar. I think more in terms of my personal observation, multi-layered. There'll be the global powers, there'll be the regional powers, and there'll be the others.
Yes, but I would still insist on a multipolar system, because I think that we cannot even afford to shift the axis from left to right, from, say, east to west, into north and south, because it's still too orderly and playing to our convenience. Practically, I see at least three polarities right now, which are building up. United States still being one polar. The other one is China, no doubt about that. The third one is Russia. One would say, wait a minute, Russia used to be USSR, now it's not really a superpower in the, with the might that they used to have in the past. First of all, we should not forget that this is really a nuclear superpower. And also, I would add to that the strategic connection that starts to be built between Iran, which soon, if nobody will interrupt it, would become nuclear as well, and Russia. So at least this alliance between Russia and Iran should be regarded as a third polar within the multipolar system altogether.
I'd like to ask you, Dr. Weinstein, okay, so we've come to Russia after a long tour. I could argue that superpowers in decline are much more dangerous than superpowers on the rise, not to mention superpowers that are, you know, at ease with their position in the world. And no matter what will happen with Ukraine, Russia will get out of the war weaker than it entered. What are the dangers? What can Russia do? Will it continue to Moldova? Will there be a threat, you know, to NATO even in World War III, as some of the pundits in the studios are saying day in and day out? Where do you see Russia is heading?
First, let me turn back to what Professor Ganor said. I see a tripolar world developing. I agree with you on the first two poles, the U.S., China. The third pole I see developing is India. That India recognizes, well, first, it's going to be the largest country population-wise. We're seeing shift of manufacturing now to India out of China as people start to do their China plus one strategies. We're also now
None of you mentioned the European Union. That's interesting.
Yeah. Then we're also seeing the immense pull that India has to the global south. And and that this pull, I think, is something that poses, I think, more of a challenge to China than to the United States in a tripolar system. But I think it's something we need to pay attention to. On Russia, actually, yes, there is absolute danger that Russia will try to lash out if it is humiliated. Loss of face is something that dictators do not take well. I find it hard to believe, given the current state of the Russian military, that Russia will have the ability to do much aside from the potential threat which is serious, of a tactical nuclear attack, which apparently is now allegedly off the table after some very blunt words from the United States. So I am actually less worried about Russia. Russia certainly needs to lick its wounds. Russia will be developing this strategic partnership with Iran, but I think it's going to have a very hard time getting the kind of forces it needs to go into Moldova, even to move things more tightly with Belarus. I think it's going to be a real challenge. Putin is humiliated on the world stage.
Ambassador Kausikan, perhaps one of the problems with our, you know, hindsight 2020 vision, we, all four of us here, and perhaps many other people in the world too, are too rational, too committed to our Western way of looking at the world, because as Dr. Weinstein said, that it's not the rational thing to do for Russia, but let's go back to Sarajevo 1914, and people and countries do not do the rational thing, do not do what is expected of them. They go into war because of national pride, because of loss of faith, because of other things, and this might be one of the global dangers today.
Well, it can be, but you know, there's not only one sort of rationality. There are many rationalities. There's not only one sort of logic, there are many logics, right? And something that may be illogical to us is because we don't share the first premise. For example, it's not a bipolar world. I think we all agree on that. Is it a tripolar world? We can argue about which is the third pole, right? But I think it's something more subtle is developing and something more complex. It is a world of fluid multipolarity. What do I mean by that? I mean different coalitions of countries, big, small, medium-sized, forming and reforming around different issues. Some may include the US but not China. Some may include China but not the US. Some may include both. Some may exclude both. And I think you will see the beginnings of this already in a very initial kind of way. But I think the direction is clear. And it stems from...
I want to stop you for a minute. When you talk about alliances, etc.
No, alliances. I say coalitions. That's
okay,
different.
coalitions. One of the great strengths of the United States, at the moment at least, it's got many allies, some of them in NATO and the others, and China, except Russia, perhaps North Korea and others, do not have real allies. They have coalitions. but not real allies.
Look, I think you know the Western alliance. Mr. Putin deserves a medal. He has reinvigorated NATO and the Atlantic Alliance, just as Mr. Xi deserves a medal. He created the Quad. He created AUKUS.
Yeah.
But that's not the really important thing. If you look at least my area, right, East Asia, the Indo-Pacific, we call it, right. Japanese interests, Australian interests, South Korean interests, they align greatly with the United States. But greatly is not totally.
Of course.
There are concerns in Japan, in South Korea, in Australia about American behavior, and therefore they will seek what I call the strategic flexibility. And that creates a different kind of multipolarity. It is not a stable multipolarity. On some issues, they will align with the US. On some issues, India will join them, as in the Quad. But not on every issue. On some issues, Singapore, small as we are, will join certain coalitions with China, but not every issue. We'll join with the US. And that's what I mean. It's a much more complex thing. I understand I'm not a great fan of international relations theory, and I think you do better to study history. But I think I'm not a great fan either of simplistic historical analogies. That can be rather dangerous. And this World War I analogy is one that I'm rather sick of hearing, because the world has fundamentally changed. The military technologies have fundamentally changed. Human nature may not have changed, so mistakes can always happen, but it will be different kinds of mistakes.
Of course. Professor Ganor, I'd like to ask you, the ambassador mentioned that, you know, he's coming from Singapore, a small country between powers, so of course it is one of the positions of Israel. How much are we, take us to what you see about the Middle East, especially concerning the regional powers of Turkey and Iran. In Turkey, where in all probability, President Erdogan will be re-elected in several days. And Iran, where are they heading? What should Israel do in this shifting the sand under our feet?
Looking from an Israeli perspective on this global change that we're discussing here, I see 4 trends that raise our concern. The first one, we've talked about that. That's the American change of power within the global system. You were talking about powers that decline. It's not just Russia. In a way, I think it's a zero-sum game. So United States is also losing power, and China is gaining more power. Maybe India is one of the examples. That, of course, has an immediate impact on the allies of United States. And you were talking about what's going on with the allies. I see in the recent few years a huge disappointment from American allies, not necessarily from Israel. I'm talking about mainly Arab allies. And I do believe that
Saudi Arabia,
I mean, after Aramco, Saudi Arabia understood or believed that there is no big brother to protect them. And that's, in one way, I think, brought up or pushed forward the Abraham Accords. I think that they were looking for, if not a huge brother in United States, maybe a small brother nearer to them. They are becoming disappointment from the Israeli behavior as well, and that's why they are starting a kind of a romance with Iran. So that's
with Chinese bringing them together,
of course. So that's the first concern. The second concern is Iran per se. At least from an Israeli point of view, we have a growing power. I don't want to say superpower. They're not superpower, but they are definitely regional power, growing one, which is going to become nuclear sooner than later and have a huge impact. But this local power are officially stating that they have a practical goal or an ultimate goal to exterminate Israel. I mean, there is no precedent in history when one state, acknowledged state, declare that they have a goal to exterminate another state. And once they would have this capability, we should take them seriously. That's the second concern that we should take into consideration. The third one has to do with the regional, immediate, or say, borders of Israel, which has very strong ties to the strategic threat of Iran. And I refer to Hezbollah. We heard yesterday the chief of the military intelligence, stating that Hezbollah is probably planning something that might deteriorate into a war in the region. Now, a war in the region, you know, the Israelis are seeing in themselves another operation in Gaza. This is a different ballgame. The next war, which will be a multi-border war, it would be unprecedented to anything Israel knew before, and it would be unprecedented to any of what our enemies knew before. So, and we should take this under consideration. That's the third concern. Just to mention that Hezbollah has today 150,000 rockets aimed towards Israel, and didn't say anything about Syria and Gaza and so on and so forth. The fourth concern has to do with the Palestinians. This is also a transition time. We don't know when the time of Abu Mazen will end, but it's quite clear that it's not going to be too long, and nothing good expects after the death of Abu Mazen. It will definitely change. If you would like, you can add a fifth one, and this is the transformation in Israel itself,
of course,
with the regime revolution that we see.
Dr. Weinstein, I'd like to go to another area altogether. We talked about politics and the geostrategy, etc. What about some of the changes that are happening, the processes that affect geostrategy? I mean, shortage of food because of Ukrainian war, etc. I mean about the global climate change, again, affecting food, affecting, I'm talking about immigration, again, affected by, and about the global economic crisis. From 2008, we are talking about the subprime, and then the Arab Spring and its implications, and then Brexit, and then Corona, and then Ukraine, all of them in 15 years, affecting everything from inflation to standard of living all around the world. How all these will come together, because obviously nothing good will come from them.
No, we're living obviously in a deeply interconnected world in which Russia goes into Ukraine, price of natural gas spikes, Europeans need to find new places for natural gas, food crises looming against a bigger backdrop of climate change and population shifts and the like. The deeper issue to me, beyond all of these things, is the lack of trust in the establishment in so many countries, which we see it here in Israel, we see it certainly in the United States. You've certainly seen it in Europe with both in Brexit and also in some of the more right-wing parties doing well in the European Parliament. Populist parties getting a majority of the vote in France now in the National Assembly. So we're at a really strange moment in which the kind of expertise and the kind of technocratic expertise that was supposed to lead us to solve the crises really found itself facing a massive challenge with COVID, finds itself finding a massive challenge with climate change, is unable to convince, to get the kind of democratic, the kind of democratic support that it needs to in order to deal with the kinds of crises that are oftentimes at heart are scientific, technical ones that the population can't understand. So there's a crisis of consent that affects all of us as well. So it's a much deeper crisis, and one that given the multifold nature of these crises, I think we're going to be bouncing from crisis to crisis for some time.
And not only that, we see the polarizing of politics all around the world, meaning that the wise old man who used to be to do the both sides of the aisle for the greater good of the country, etc., it's no longer there. If you vote for the other party to what you perceive as the best of the country, you're a traitor to your party, to your people, to the people who sent you, and it will not be done. And it's, again, affecting U.S. politics, Israeli politics, and other politics as well.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing it in a big way in the United States. We've learned that the gray-haired man, and being one of them, doesn't necessarily have all the wisdom. And we've seen, even in the United States in the last few weeks, the Durham report on the FBI's investigation of Russiagate exposed just what a conspiracy it was to start this investigation. And it has a real impact on debates in our country where people no longer trust the institutions they should trust.
Ambassador, you said before, and rightly so, that there are many points of view to the world, and the West got used to it, that the Western point of view is the only legitimate one. Of course, it dictated it to the rest of the world. And I want to talk about democracy. I mean, for many, many years, all of us learned that democracy is the best, is the only one who can bring you prosperity and freedom, etc., etc., etc. We see today crisis of democracy all around the world, and people turning to places like your country to see, look, here is an authoritarian regime that works, that benefits the people, and where do we go from here?
Are we an authoritarian regime? I didn't notice.
Well,
look, democracy, authoritarianism, these are protean terms. There are many types of democracy, there are many types of authoritarianism.
of course.
Not everybody looks at every variant of, every aspect of every variant of Western democracy with great admiration. Not everybody looks at every aspect of every variant of authoritarianism with great abhorrence. These are two simplistic frameworks to analyze the world.
And of course,
When
it's
you
a
say
continuity.
When you say democracy is in crisis, what you really mean is some Western liberal democracies have become much more dysfunctional than absolutely necessary. All democracies of every variant are to some degree dysfunctional by design, because power is distrusted, it has to be distributed. But some variants have become far more dysfunctional than absolutely necessary. Doesn't mean democracy, which is a big word, so big that it's practically meaningless unless you define it in more specific categories, is alive and well. How many, every country, even North Korea, defines itself by defines itself as some variant of democracy. It's only a handful of countries, mainly in the Middle East, one in my own region, Brunei, that are still monarchies, absolute monarchies. So when you say democracy, and people tell me democracy is in crisis, I tend to yawn a bit and, and think about something else.
So when we say the democracy in crisis, what do you see that the world is going to be in the next 20 years? Because let's go back to history, places that you love. And after World War II, everybody thought that dictatorship is the future. 1924, Brave New World, these were the books. And the thought was that democracy will be in decline. It gained its peak at something like 2000. And from then again, more people are living under dictatorships or semi-dictatorships or authoritarian or populist regimes. Do we see again a clash of ideologies there?
Clash of ideologies never went away. It's just the different ideologies that were clashing changed over time. I think it's wrong to look at history or international relations as having any particular direction. It's not a teleological process that, up and on to some end. Democracy has many disadvantages, so has authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is better placed to set and pursue goals over the long term, but that's only an advantage if the goal you set is the correct one in the first place. And as we have seen, Putin's Russia, actually Xi Jinping's China, many of the goals set are not particularly good. So I don't really look at the world in the terms that you have sketched out. I see a world that is messy. It's always been messy. It's got a bit more messy here, perhaps because we are in a transition from one thing. But perhaps we are always going to be a state of transition. It's not wrong to think that you're going to transit to another stable state. It can be always a state of dislocated equilibrium, if you like put it that way.
And to your area of expertise, Professor Ganor, we see less, of course, because it's happening elsewhere. It's happening in Asia, in Africa, the terror attacks of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, etc., etc. So we pay less attention. But where do you see global jihadistic terrorism going in the next few years?
With your permission, Oren, I would like to refer to the previous question, and then I will answer that. I fully agree that there are many variants of democracies all over, but it reminds me of a discussion that I had more than 10 years ago with Condoleezza Rice. I spent my sabbatical year at Stanford. She just stepped out of her position as the Secretary of State. And she gave a lecture at Stanford referring to what happened a few years before, and this is the election that Hamas won within the Palestinian Authority. And she finished her discussion on that, and she said, you know what, I'm not that concerned from the fact that Hamas won the election, because democracy is stronger than Hamas. And I said to myself, what are you talking about? Democracy? Do you see any other precedent in which Islamist fundamentalists winning election and then being voted out? In a discussion that I held with her afterwards, I said, what if in one day Islamist jihadist movement is winning an election, and the first thing they do, democratic election, first thing they do, they change the constitution into a Sharia law-governed constitution. Is this progressing democracy or going back? The answer was very interesting. After thinking, she said, I'm not sure there is a contradiction between a Sharia law-governed state and a democracy. Okay. Now, this is food for thought for the Israelis here about what is happening as we speak.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very interesting
discussion. Very American
discussion.
way of looking at this.
Thank you, Dr. Weinstein. Thank you, Ambassador Kausikan. Thank you, Professor Ganor. Thank you all for listening. Have a great day.